The terror group ISIS and their ideology was the focus of a hearing held by the Senate Homeland Security Committee. We heard from a Yazidi woman who was captured and enslaved by ISIS and then escaped. Members also discussed how the group's ideology relates to and motivates so-called lone wolf actors, like the mass shooter in Orlando, Florida. From Capitol Hill, this is about 2 hours.
Good morning. This hearing will come to order. We do have one witness who parked over Union Station. He's making his way over here, so I thought we'd get going and he can join us when he gets here. I want to thank the witnesses for appearing, for your time, for your testimony. The mission statement of this committee, you've heard it repeatedly, but I'll repeat it again, is to enhance the economic and national security of America. On the Homeland Security side, one of our top 4 priorities is certainly doing whatever we can to keep our homeland safe, to counter Islamic terror. The goal of every hearing, from my standpoint, coming from a manufacturing background, I solved a lot of problems. The first step in solving a problem is admitting you have one, properly defining it, identifying it, defining it, but really facing reality. And so the goal of every hearing is to lay out a reality, so that certainly the members of the committee, the people in the audience, understand what we're dealing with a particular problem. Today's hearing is our 8th hearing dealing with some form of component of the threat we face from Islamic terror. It's a harsh reality. It's one I wish was not true. It was one I wish we didn't have to face, but we have to. We're going to be hearing testimony today that will be hard to hear. It'll be hard to hear. But it's testimony that I think is incredibly important for us to hear. So again, I thank the witnesses for appearing. I would ask that my written statement be entered in the record without objection. It's important for us to understand that Islamic terrorists declared war on the United States. Quite honestly, Islamic terrorists declared war on the civilized world. We didn't declare war on them, they declared war on us. I can't exactly point to the date, but certainly one that's pretty visible was the first attempt to bring down the Twin Trade Towers. That was on February 26, 1993. And the fact that we didn't face the full reality right there and then, I think eventually led to the fact that we then faced the tragedy of 9/11, where almost 3,000 Americans were slaughtered in that terrorist attack. Now, there are 2 ways to end a war, only 2 ways. Either one side defeats the other, or both sides decide to lay down their arms. The tragic events of yet another ISIS-inspired terror attack on this country in Orlando has proven Islamic terrorists are not laying down their arms. So the only way we're going to end this war, the only way we're going to keep our homeland safe, return peace to the civilized world, is if we defeat Islamic terrorists, if we defeat ISIS. Now, on September 10th, 2014, President Obama laid out America's goal as it relates to ISIS. It was pretty simply stated: to degrade and ultimately defeat them. That was 22 months ago. 22 months ago. In testimony last week before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, CIA Director John Brennan laid out the reality as it relates to our success or lack thereof in our war on ISIS. And he testified, and this is a quote, that ISIS remains a formidable, resilient, and largely cohesive enemy, and that our efforts have not reduced their terrorism capability and their global reach. Now, that is a depressing reality after 22 months, but it's a reality we have to face. So, again, I just want to thank the witnesses. Don't hold back. Lay out the reality. Make sure that certainly the senators on this dais, that the American people understand the threat, the enemy we face, and why it is just crucial that we actually defeat them. I wish they'd lay down their arms. I wish they'd declare peace, but it doesn't seem like that's going to happen. With that, I'll turn it over to my ranking member, Senator Carper.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank you for delaying this hearing for a week so that our witnesses could be assembled and we have more time to prepare for this hearing. We welcome each of you. Thank you for coming and sharing with us your stories and your perspectives. They are valued, and we're delighted that you could come. I want to just follow up very briefly on how the fight against ISIS is going. I went over a map today of that part of the world, and the U.S. and our coalition forces, which now number about 60 nations, have recaptured almost 50% of the land that ISIS held once in Iraq and in Syria. Almost 50%. I think we're up to about 47%. ISIS has also lost 20% of the land it once held in Syria. Ramadi and Tikrit were key victories for U.S.-backed Iraqi forces. And last Friday, Iraqi forces, ground forces, captured the city center of Fallujah and are now working to clear out the last few pockets of resistance in that city. And so it's only, 25 miles west of Baghdad. As we speak, Kurdish, Iraqi, and Syrian democratic forces backed by the U.S. Special Forces are making preparations to retake ISIS key strongholds in Mosul and Raqqa. We've killed some 25,000 ISIS fighters and more than 120 key ISIS leaders. We've cut ISIS funds by a third or more. We've literally destroyed hundreds of millions of dollars in cash that they were hoarding, and we've reduced by a dramatic amount their ability to realize profits from oil reserves and resources in that part of the world. We've drastically slowed the flow of foreign recruits from a high of about 2,000 a month in 2014 to 200 a month today. And that also goes for young Americans who have sought to travel to join ISIS abroad. 1 year ago, about every month, about 10 Americans were leaving this country to join ISIS. Today, that number is 1 per month. And at home, the FBI is cracking down on recruits as well. And over the past 2 years, the FBI has arrested 88 individuals on ISIS-related charges. I was a naval flight officer for 23 years, combined active and reserve duty. I served 5 years in a hot war in Southeast Asia. I know a little bit about fighting wars. And another 18 years right up to the end of the Cold War as a P-3 aircraft mission commander. And one of the ways we're going to win this fight is not by ourselves. There's not an appetite in this country for putting boots on the ground. But there is an appetite for working with a coalition of countries throughout the region and around the world. And that is what we're doing. And I believe we're making progress. Is it perfect? Are we where we want to be? Is this where we want to go? No, it is not. But I think we're making progress. The other thing I want to say, last Saturday, 9 days ago, 10 days ago. My wife and I went up to New York. We have a son who lives in that area in the city. And he took us for Father's Day and his mom's birthday, took us to a 9/11 museum, which is built, located right on the location of where the Twin Towers once stood. I was reminded there, as we saw the faces and the names and heard the voices of the family members of some 3,000 people who died that day. I was reminded of the way we responded to that tragedy. In this room, we helped to create the 9/11 Commission. In this room, we received some 40 recommendations, bipartisan group, 9/11 Commission, presented to us by Tom Kean, former governor of New Jersey, presented to us by Lee Hamilton, former House Chairman of Foreign Relations Committee, co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission. They presented to us, after months and months of work, some 40 recommendations that they came to unanimously on what we could do to reduce the likelihood that these kinds of attacks would occur again. We adopted maybe 80% of them, again, almost unanimously, and then set about implementing them. The response to that tragedy was bipartisan. It was a unified approach, and I think ultimately it's been successful. Ultimately, it's been successful. And when you compare that response to the tragedy in Orlando, could not be more different. Could not be more different. My hope today is that we're going to have the kind of conversation with all of you that will enable us to better improve this fight. And this is a fight that we're going to win, fight against ISIS, and we have a lot of allies, and they happen to be not just folks in this country, not just people who might be Catholic or Protestant, people of all faiths, including the Muslim faith. And together, we're going to prevail. Thank you so much. And Mr. Chairman, I have to ask that unanimous consent, if I could, that the rest of my statement be entered in the record. Thank you.
Without objection. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if you all rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Please be seated. Our first witness is Mr. Hassan Hassan. Mr. Hassan is an associate fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. Mr. Hassan co-authored ISIS Inside the Army of Terror. In 2008, he started working in Abu Dhabi in journalism and research focusing on Syria, Iraq, and Gulf states, and studying Islamicists, Salafists, and jihadist movements in the wider region. Mr. Hassan.
Thank you, Chairman Johnson and Ranking Member Carper, members of the committee. By way of introduction, I also want to add that I come from an ISIS-controlled area that is still controlled today. I've also interviewed dozens of ISIS members for my book and other research. And I want to say this: this is not a sectarian war. The very people that ISIS claims to represent are victims of its brutality just as much as everyone else. This is reality felt on a daily basis when family and friends go to the market and see severed heads on pipes, or when ISIS condemns its Sunni opponents, people that they claim to represent, as apostates. They burn them alive, they stab their hearts before they shoot them, they display their dead bodies for days in central squares. When it says to its fellow Sunnis, it doesn't matter if you pray, if you fast in Ramadan, if you turn your face towards Mecca and pray, we will still kill you as long as you don't pledge allegiance to us. Not far from where I come from, in my area called Deir Zor, ISIS killed 700 Sunni villagers in a matter of days because they dared to stand up against the group. I want to move on to say that as a belief system, those who believe in the sort of Islamic State ideology are a minority, not only in the Muslim world, but also within the group. During my research, I found that members come in 6 categories. 1, long-standing religious radicals who deviate even from Al-Qaeda. For example, they believe that there's no sanctity of life. Unlike Al-Qaeda, which for example, justifies killing civilians, but only as collateral damage, ISIS considers killing civilians itself is the preferred outcome. In fact, just like a month ago, exactly a month ago, the spokesperson of ISIS said, when he called for sympathizers in the West, in Europe, and in the United States to launch attacks, he said, I received complaints from people, sympathizers, saying we couldn't find military targets and we are afraid to kill civilians. And he said there's no such thing as innocent civilians in the West. And in fact, he moved on to say, we prefer that you kill civilians. And he said, I don't have time to justify that. Basically, he didn't even have the justification during the statement. And the second category of people who join ISIS are young zealots who are victims of the first category. People who are, between 12 to 17. People who are drawn to this idea of a caliphate and so on and so forth. They're brainwashed. They are taught Islam in a way that ISIS understands. It distorts a lot of things, and because people don't have religious knowledge, they hear a lot of the events and the traditions that ISIS relates for the first time. And there's a third category, which is very important, people who are drawn to ISIS political ideology, not religious one, and this is a major problem, not only within ISIS, but I think in the region. People who are drawn to this political ideology, not only for ISIS but Al-Qaeda and other Islamist groups, because they think there is political stagnation in the region, and only these groups can actually shake up the political order in the region. And I think Omar Mateen belongs to this category of people who are only superficially influenced by this organization. He obviously didn't follow their way of life, but he was still animated probably by this idea of the Islamic State. The other categories are those who are drawn to the group because of its military success, model of governance, attraction to brutality, or simply they're profiteers. But the group, and this is important, but the group swims in a sea of political failures in the region, and that's where we should focus. It's not a surprise, for example, that ISIS emerged in Iraq and in Syria, countries that suffered unimaginable brutality, violence over the past decade in the case of Iraq, and half-decade in the case of Syria. The group has built its narrative around the idea of Sunni victimization. It benefited from the brutal reality in both Iraq and Syria to say that Sunnis are systematically under attack by Iranian-backed militias or governments or governments in those two countries, and that the two greatest superpowers in the world are helping both of them, and that there are traitors, apostates, in other words, in our midst who help them. It's important, without downplaying the genocidal acts of ISIS, to highlight that the regime of Bashar al-Assad in Damascus had carried out almost all the atrocities, probably without an exception, that ISIS has committed even before ISIS arrived in Syria. In 2012, for example, pro-government militias in Syria stormed villages, slaughtered children and women, and smashed using rocks at the heads of condemned people. And I just want to conclude by saying and emphasizing that ISIS thrives in this context and should be defeated in this context to stem its international appeal. This can only happen at the hands of the very people that ISIS claims to represent. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hassan. Our next witness is Dr. Tariq El-Gawari. Dr. El-Gawari is the Director of Religious Studies Programs for the World Organization for Resource Development and Education. Dr. El-Gawari also serves as the CEO of the Coexist Corporation and a trustee of the Coexist Foundation. He has a PhD from Princeton in Islamic law, and he studied traditional Islamic sciences at Al-Azhar Seminary in Cairo, Egypt. Dr. El-Gawari.
Senators Johnson, Senators Carper, thank you very much for this opportunity. Other members of the committee, I'd like to make very brief introductory remarks and save the other maybe discussion points for questions and answers. I'd like to add to what Senator Johnson said in the beginning, that before ISIS or ISIL and other related groups declared war on our homeland, they declared war on Islam. And this is not only a threat to our homeland, not only a threat to our national security, but an existential threat to our religion. Normative Islam, in both its Sunni and Shia expressions, is defined by a very robust interpretive methodology. That's what you go to seminary to be trained in. Very briefly, this interpretive methodology requires one to understand the divine texts, to understand the text of the Quran, to understand the various statements of the Prophet. There are 6,236 verses in the Quran. There are about 60 to 70,000 prophetic texts. In their different narrations, there's over 100,000 narrations of these prophetic texts. Understanding the divine text means understanding about a dozen different sciences, beginning with Arabic grammar, syntax, morphology, logic, all of these different interpretive tools that we use to understand what does the text actually mean in the context in which it was revealed. The second thing is to understand the context that we live in now, the current moment, understanding full well that people change, times change, circumstance change, and location and place change. How does one fast the month of Ramadan in the northern latitudes in which the early Muslim generations never experienced? How do we deal with usury in the light of fiat currency that's not backed by gold or silver bullion, so on and so forth? So then that further adds that one needs to understand the current moment that we live in and its complexity and its changing. And then the third aspect of this interpretive paradigm is how do we link the divine text into the current moment in which we live. And that, as we were taught, is a talent. Not everyone is endowed with that type of talent. Violent and extremist groups like ISIL have no interpretation whatsoever, nor do they have a fundamental understanding of Islam. They are unlettered warmongers who have, in essence, created a parallel religion. Yet this parallel religion that they call to is no more Islamic than a pool with one lemon squeezed in it is lemonade. And because of their gross misunderstanding of the primary text, because of their lack of a robust interpretive methodology, the good news is we are able to identify what is so wrong with their thinking. And in my work and in my analysis, I have been able to deduce about a half a dozen or so main concepts that they have, and been able to trace them back to a certain cluster of sources that are used by every single Islamist extremist group from the middle of the 20th century until our time today. And in that, I'm able to isolate those concepts. We're able to provide a counter-narrative and deal with it. Now, I don't have an army at my disposal. I don't own any weapons whatsoever. I leave that to the law enforcement. But what I do have is I have my intellect, I have my scholarly training, and I can employ that to provide a robust counter-narrative to inoculate our youth, to protect the next generation, and to make it absolutely unequivocally clear that what ISIL represents, what they stand for, has nothing to do with the religion whatsoever. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. El-Gawari. Our next witness is Mr. Subhai Nahas. Mr. Nahas is an activist for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender rights who fled Syria in 2012 after receiving threats from soldiers and jihadists because of his sexual preference. Mr. Nahas fled first to Lebanon and then to Turkey, where he applied with the United Nations for refugee status. He was granted refugee status after a year and has since moved to the United States. In August 2015, he testified before the United Nations Security Council Summit on LGBT rights in Syria. Mr. Nahas.
Chairman Johnson, Ranking Member Carper, members of the committee, thank you for offering me the honor and the opportunity to be here today to share my story in the context of the larger events happening here in the world and here in the United States. My personal story mirrors the stories of many, many other LGBT individuals. One day I was heading to university. An organized group of militants accosted and threatened me solely because they perceived me as gay. In a local mosque, it had been announced that they would cleanse the city of all sodomites. ISIS had not yet been formed, yet militants and the regime targeted all gay men in the country. I fled from my home country of Syria in 2012. After living in a country of Lebanon for 6 months, I moved to Turkey. My history of activism for LGBT rights meant that even in Turkey, I once again find myself in danger. Extremist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS were gaining strength and access there. Although I was employed for 2 years in a senior position with Save the Children International, I was still not safe because of my sexual identity. A Syrian friend informed me that I had been targeted for death. My director at Save the Children helped me register with the UN Refugee Agency to be resettled to a safer country. Prior to my resettlement, I completed an extremely thorough screening process, which included testifying under oath in front of an officer from the DHS, security checks, medical tests, and cultural orientation. After this 10-month process, I was relocated to San Francisco. In August 2015, a few months after resettlement, I spoke before members of the UN Security Council about the threats to sexual minorities in the Middle East during a historic event organized by the United States and Chile. As I stated during the meeting and to the press, along with Ambassador Samantha Power, ISIS was simply one of many threats to the LGBT community in the Middle East. Reports from recent refugees of Syria say that ISIS and other groups actively target gay people. It is enough just to be perceived as gay by them, to be arrested, tortured, or raped. Then this perceived gay person can be thrown off of a building to a cheerful crowd that will stone them to death if they are not dead. While ISIS is viewed by the public eye as the most notorious group in Syria and Iraq, it may come as a surprise that their methodology, when it comes to the treatment of LGBT people, is very similar to many other groups, including governments themselves. We know that many groups, including ISIS, target and kill gay people in Syria. They just use different methods to kill. While good fortune has allowed me to begin a new, much safer life as a refugee in the United States, recent events in Orlando show that LGBT people still face huge challenges here. The New York Times reported on June 16th, even before the shooting rampage at the gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people were already the most likely targets of hate crimes in America, according to analysis of data collected by the FBI. Put simply, efforts to discredit the poisonous ideology of ISIS and other extremist groups, while extremely important, are insufficient to completely erase the threats of anti-LGBT violence, either here in this country or abroad. Rather, we must also commit to combating homophobia, xenophobia, and bigotry in all of its various forms, regardless of the source. In order to deal with these issues, I recommend two things. One, through the bridges and convening power unique to the United Nations, support actions that promote not only human rights for LGBT persons, but also love, inclusion, tolerance, and equality among religions and communities. This required continued U.S. leadership at forums like the UN Human Rights Council and supporting funding for the UN institutions like the UN Refugee Agency. Statements such as the one issued by the Security Council on Monday condemning the Orlando attack are critical. This statement specifically denounced for the first time violence targeting people as a result of their sexual orientation, and it received support from Russia and Egypt. This will make it more difficult for those countries and others to argue that sexual orientation is not a recognized international human right. Two, we need partnerships across communities that can address the serious negative consequences of ISIS ideology, including assisting the communities affected by it. For example, I have launched a Spectra project which assists LGBT refugees in the Middle East and North Africa region by providing shelter and education, while also promoting in the US and abroad a more positive image of the LGBT people. So thank you again for this opportunity, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Nahas. Our final witness is Ms. Nadia Murad. Ms. Murad is a Yazidi rights activist and one of the thousands of Yazidi women who were abducted and enslaved by ISIS. Since her escape, Nadia has been outspoken about her experiences to draw attention to the ongoing genocide. Earlier this year, the Iraqi government nominated her for the 2016 Nobel Peace Prize. Ms. Murad. I'll mention that Murad, coincidentally, is her interpreter. Thank you.
سيد تشيرمان أعضاء مجلس الشيوخ سكالك شو ممنونم جو ودعوام الفيديو كريا وسكالك كيف خوشم جو يروز بيكي بشارك.
Mr. Chairman, dear senators, I'm very grateful and very happy to be testifying among you, and thank you for the opportunity.
بري هرتشتكي مدويز بجماوا قد جريمة هكال أورلاندو تشيبوي دلي مقالك إيشان جبروان ضحية جبر نفساوي إرهابي بوجبر نفسا ما خلقي عادي بون ضحياوي تشت.
The first thing I would like to tell you is that I was heartbroken when I witnessed the crimes in Orlando because for the same reason, for no reason, they were killed and they were abused just the way I was.
أو تشتبوي أسبينا فاجئين إجبر مزاني شروجا مداعش دديتي مزاني قو أف إرهاب هكت نها تسكناندن ويكاربي جريمة خوابقهنيا هر جهكي.
But I wasn't surprised by this because I knew if ISIS was not stopped, they will deliver their crimes everywhere.
كس هات ما قرتن حمري من 19 سال بون بشش هزار كچو جنو زارو كي إيز ديارس هات ما سبي كرن.
When I was captured, I was 19 years old. I was one of the 6,000 Yazidi women and children who were taken into captivity.
وبري سالوني وكيو بيهتر سيمها 1814 هجوم داعش لسر إيزديا فقد وان الديت إيزدي كافرون أهل الكتاب لازمة كشتناوان كامل يا زلامات شبه بوسابي كرنا جنو زارو كدوان ببي.
This happened on August 2014, more than a year and a half now, and ISIS attacked the Yazidis for one reason, because they are considered infidels, not people of the book, and their interpretation is that the men must be killed and the women and the children must be enslaved.
وأو تشتسر مهاتا طبقان دن قوب هزارة جنو زارو زلام كشتن الروجا بريد الشنغالي.
And this is what they applied to us. Thousands of men, women and children were killed in the first day of the attack in Sinjar.
وسر 6,000 إنساني إيزدي الروجة هرد قرم تريدا الجادة محاصر كرن.
In the hottest days of the summer, more than 100,000 Yazidis were stranded on the mountain.
أفتشتب مهاتا كرن راستا جريمة العراق وسوريا دا تشيبون وقالك خلق بوضحية بيتشتي بس يا إيزديات تشتكي مختلف بو.
It's true that crimes were committed in Iraq and Syria, but what happened to the Yazidis was different.
برنامج هزاريت كتشكارة الموصلة أمبونا سبيا نفدست داعش دا.
I was one of the girls who were enslaved in Mosul. I was one of the among the thousands of the women who were taken to Mosul.
تشتي هاري بريب ماكرين أم هادنا وزعاندن والبي وزعاندن يرى المحكمة موصل دا دستي ملصر قرآني كرنقو أم ديني خواب غيرين.
The first thing they did in Mosul was to, after distributing us to the fighters, was to taking us to the court and have us convert by putting our hand on the Quran.
راستس بوما سبيا وسهاد ما اغتصاب كرن وسهاد ما فروتن وسهاد ما بدلاندن بس النفس الوقت ده مدفيا هر كچكا كشوان 6,000 كچو جنو زاروكيت إيزديات قاسم بانشبر اغتصاب بحقي كچكان هساليا حلال بو السروي الشريعة دولة الإسلامية.
It is true that I was raped and sold and was abused, but I was lucky. I wish that everyone from the 6,000 women and children was like me, because girls at age of 9 were raped as well.
الجندي مدى الخلالات الساعات هذا كشتنا هفسد إنساني إيزدي والنيف وعنده شش براو داك عمجي هاتنا كشتنا الروجة كده بس شما إيزدي بنوجدينا كي مختلف.
Only in 2 hours in my village, more than 700 men were killed. Among them were 6 of my brother, and the same day my mother was killed too, for no reason but for having a different religion.
أسنابجم إسلام همو إرهابا بس داعش تشتمجي فيهم كري داعش إسلامي متليني.
I'm not saying that ISIS represents the Islam, but ISIS is using the Islam to commit these crimes.
ولازم تشبه ساكناندن كفكر بري همو تشتي.
And this need to stop as an ideology first.
جبر القلق أجينا هاتيا كرن قوب بنا داعش وكو خلق الشنقالي دا وقت الرابو وهاتين بداعش الرابو إنكارن أو جحالي خبقنا إيزد يا دركبن بس بكيف بون قوب داعش الرابو نبي تشتي بالطبق.
Many people in the area that had the choice to leave when ISIS came, but they were happy to join the Islamic State when they came.
قالك تشتهيس إيرو بيجم بس مع الأسف وقت نينا قوس هموي بيجم وأسنكارم همو بإنجليزي شورا بيجم قوس كارم الوقت خودا خلاصكم.
There is many things for me to testify about to tell you today. Just the time is limited and I don't speak English. I wish I could tell you more.
إجبروكي مدوي دقيقة كزيدة بس سبايفا.
I would like you to give me one more minute if possible.
Honestly, take your time. We want to hear the story. Please. Take whatever time it takes.
أفتشت هاتا كرن وهاتا طبقة عندن السر إيزديا وهاتان هفتشتي مستمرة.
This was committed against the Yazidis first and it's still continuous until now.
أفرسالة مجهان دم مصر وكويت إجبر في تشتي بنابي إسلامتيتي يا كرن.
I delivered this message to Egypt and to Kuwait because this what is happening is being happening under the name of Islam.
بمرة أو خلكي تعاطف بو أو خلك بمرة رابو جو أفتشت منامت ليني.
People there they had a sympathy and they said this does not represent us.
بس هاتانو هيكش ما همو كانت يقوش كي آلي ديني با الدولة العربية داعش هات يكفر عندن.
But we have not seen that Daesh have been labeled as infidel group within Islam from any Muslim country.
وكطلبا من الشيخ الأزهر كدي مصر دم جو داعش بكافرينا بس داعش نهاتا كفر عندن.
And I ask the leader of Azhar in Cairo is to say that ISIS is an infidel group within Islam and he has not committed to it yet.
وقالك خلق العراقي كتشكد يزديا بازدات كدنا مالي دواندا بس خدا نتكرن وكارين مساعدة بكن جي دزي وكدرين المساعدة بكن بس وانجي نفسها داعش نيري جو كافرن.
Many families in Iraq and Syria, when the Yazidi women and girls were escaping to these houses, they could have helped them, but no, they seized them and they give them back to the militants.
داعش سلاح خدانين إلا جو أم بكن داعش سلاح خدانين.
Daesh will not give up on their weapons unless we force them to give away their weapons.
بري هر تشتكي جوان آليت دولة عربية بقو منع بان شبابا بقنسر في فكري بقهنا داعش.
Before all, the Arab countries must stop the flow of their citizens into Daesh and prevent them from joining Daesh.
وأما نعيبكن قد سلاح ودرافنا قهيوان.
And we have to prevent the supplies of weapon and money to them.
وأما نعيبكن قد نفتاوان نايا فروتن.
And we prevent that their oil will not be sold.
ودور البيرة أم محاربة وان عسكريا بكن.
And then we have to fight them militarily after that.
إزدي وغيري إزديات أقليات الدينية كتشكنا العراقي ونال سوريا ده نكارن حماية خو بكن.
The Yazidis, all other religious minorities in Iraq, they are unable to protect themselves in Iraq and Syria.
كدولتك قاسي فيه نكاربه وكال أورلاندو تشيبوي حماية بكا أو بلجيكا أو فرنسا. If a
country as strong as your country cannot protect its citizens in Orlando or in Belgium or in France, how come a small minority like us can protect ourselves while we are in the heart of the land where the radicals are?
إيروس نزانم طلبات شو بكم أجبر قالك تشتهي قوس طلبيبك مجبر هطانو هذا دسالة. There
are many things for me to ask you because for 2 years we've been waiting, but the list is just too long for me to ask you. I know what is going on now with more than 3,200 Yazidi women, girls and children who are still in captivity.
متحسيان قوت تشتكي قلقي مازن إيروش مرة هاتيش بر الوسعة تدقوا منهاتنا فروتن يا منهاتنا إيجار كرن.
When I was held for every hour that passed, I was very happy and grateful for that hour if I was not sold, if I was not raped. 1 hour was counted for me and every hour was counting for me.
أسيرو راستا خلاص كريمة بس أثناء شعر مبحرية خلاص كرنيه إجبر هاتانوها محاسبة وان مجرمانة هاتيا كرن.
I was freed, but I do not enjoy the feeling of the freedom because those who committed these crimes have not been held accountable.
What
happened to the Yazidi people was a genocide. Just the first day, thousands were killed. The forced displacement of 80% of the Yazidi people who do not have the joy to have a tent to live in.
إجبر جريمة جوها سري هزار كركي إزدي والمعسكرية سوريا دد بنا داعش فصالوني بكسر نفساوي فكري.
And for holding more than 1,000 Yazidi children in Syria to be trained to have the exact same ideology that the crimes were committed under.
إجبروا كتشكت نهسالي هكا هيج الحياة الطفولية دا بونا سبية ونهال دستيوان دتنا اغتصاب كرن.
Because of the children who were at age of 9, who didn't enjoy the childhood and became slaves.
إجبر أو خلقي بويا البحر إيجاده هاتف تصاندن أو جي هرب بازدانا شوي إرهابي هر أو جي جريمة داعش.
And for the people who drowned in the Aegean Sea, and that's also a crime of ISIS because those people escaped because of ISIS.
إجبر حرماندنا زارو كيد ما بهزارش تعليمه وتشتش تلدستيواندنا ما هر أو سببه.
Because thousands of our children also have been prevented from going to school, and this is all because of them.
إيروزت بيجم همو أقلية كإيزدي ومسيحي وأقليات الديني ديت كجك هكا حماية وانها هاتكرين أو أقلية وخلاص بن.
Today I'm saying that small religious minorities such as the Yazidis, Christians and other minorities, if they are not protected, they will be wiped out.
فقط إيزديات في سلام مدفي أما بكرامة بعايشن كالكي دريبي.
We only are seeking peace. We want to live with dignity wherever we are.
وكو كجك نفسا كجك تايا ملاتي خو بس حلمي مبو جارك يسكاربم صالونك كجك ميكاب وكم أو حلم هاتا حط ما عندن بحياتها مرة كامل إجبر وياكي أف حلم كيرتي حلمي قلك كجكو جنو زارو كيد إيزد يابو نها إيرو أما بتشتكي شوي نافكرين بس متفكرين كا شلوني ما أنقاذك نجفي إبادي.
As a little girl, I had a dream, and that dream was to open a beauty salon, and I was prevented from accomplishing that dream, and that's the exact same story with thousands of children and people like me who were prevented to continue pursuing their dreams.
جنابي عنصرية ضد إسلامتي هم بيستخدم كرين ولكن أف جريمة بين بنابي إسلامتي ولازم بسلمان أول الناس بين ضد في تشتي بسكن.
The racism should not be practiced against Islam, but these crimes have been committed under the name of Islam, and the Muslim must be the first one to resist this.
ومنابي يك مهاجمة دينكي كامل بقى وكوي عائلة أس خلاص كريم الموصل ده.
And I don't like anyone to be attacking an entire religion. For example, the family that liberated me in Mosul.
بس نفس الوقت أفتشت ببنابي إسلامتي.
But at the same time, this is being committed under the name of Islam.
وجارك دي قالك شو ممنون مو كهجي سؤالك تشتكى به قالك تشتهي وقالك هاي زبيجم وهاي هطا آخر نقطة بمهاتي سكارم بذكرين مو بيجم بس قالك وقت جيجي راتبي.
There is so much time that is needed for me to tell my entire story, but now I will stop and I will give you the opportunity to ask you any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Murad. Thank you for your courage for coming forward and testifying. Let me just ask, any of your family survive?
عائلة هناك جي فلتينا دخوش كتمة وسيبرات ما هناك زارود بران.
Yes, 2 of my sisters, 3 of my brothers, and some of my nephews and nieces.
بس هتانو هجي هجدش معلم النيبا كشتي وندادينا.
18 people from my family and extended families are still, they are killed, whether they are missing.
Can you just tell us how you escaped?
بازدانا مقد بهورنا كرس خلاص ببموني كتشك إيز دي بهورنا كر خلاص بيش برم كتنا نيفا إرهاب ده.
I never believed I will be able to escape because not me or other girls, because we were held in areas it was just vastly occupied by ISIS.
محاول كراس باز بدم الروجة هريد بريد أجبر متحملها وجنت اغتصابي وبيفا جفرو تشتيت قوتنا ما هو تحملت كر.
The first couple days I tried to escape because I could not hold on more on the rape that was committed against me and the insult that was committed against me. I could not take it more. I decided to escape.
ما باز دا بس ساعات ما قرتن وعقوبة نسروي تشتي استعرضي اغتصاب الجماعي بو.
I attempted to escape, but I was not successful. I was taken back and I became a subject of rape by multiple people, collective rape.
وجارك دي وكم دي سما جال كتي مباز داو وجارز العائلة مسلاويش موصل در كتم وان مساعدة مكرب هوية كإسلامي وأسهر باند ما حدود.
The second time I attempted to escape, it was successful, and a family in Mosul helped me, and they made for me an Islamic ID, and with that ID I was able to escape from Mosul.
You mentioned there are 3,200 additional Yazidi girls and women being held captive. Are they dispersed throughout Syria and Iraq at this point in time?
أو الهرجة هكي داعش دي موجود دي هيا وهكا يرول جهة كينا بيت سباوي ايوي جهة جبر تينا فروتن وتينا كرين هرول جهة كينا أو وان عراقي وسوريا الهمو آلية داعش.
Yes, they are everywhere because they are not held in a specific place. What is happening is that they are being sold and their places will be changed from a place to another.
By the way, we are holding questioning 5 minutes because we have so many members attending this. Again, thank you, Ms. Murad. I do want to go to Dr. El-Gawahi, a real scholar in Islam. Can you just explain, is there any way for us to understand how did adherents of this barbarity, of this violence, how did it get to that point? What happened?
So, thank you, Nadia. And Nadia mentioned, so Nadia was saying that the Daesh, they don't represent Islam, but they use Islam. And she gave some examples, but they're using Islam even wrong. So, for example, they told her that she has to go to the court and she has to swear on the Quran to become a Muslim, but that's not how you become a Muslim. You become a Muslim by testifying, saying the testification of faith. So even small, mundane things, they don't even understand. And I just was so moved by what she said, and it reminded me that there's a prophetic text that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, he said, fear the supplication of the oppressed, because there is no veil between that supplication and the Lord. And he never mentioned that it's a Muslim or not a Muslim. And he also said that I am the protector of the religious, I am the defender of the religious minority on the day of judgment against the Muslim that aggresses against the religious minority. There's a lot, it's a big question that you asked, Senator Johnson, but basically the way I see it is that they are taking certain concepts or certain phrases and adding to it and appropriating to it new meaning that doesn't exist. For example, Nadia mentioned that one of the things they told her is that Yazidis don't count as the people of the book, they're apostates. But the concept of the people of the book in Islamic law is not proscriptive, it's descriptive. It describes an organized religion that has a legal code, that has a book meaning sort of a sacred text, so on and so forth. And as Muslims expanded eastward out of Arabia, they encountered Yazidis. These have been communities that have existed with Muslims and coexisted with Muslims since the first generation of Islam, up until now. And all of the other dharmic faiths, Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Shintoism, Taoism, all of these religions, Muslim scholars understood these as people of the book because it's a description, it's not proscriptive. So these differences is how they misunderstand certain things. The basic axis around which this thinking exists is this concept of takfirism, or declaring people to be apostates. I'm an apostate according to them, so therefore they can aggress against me. Why am I apostate? Because I don't agree with what they agree, I don't pledge allegiance to them, so on and so forth. And with this tactic, they go on and on and on. But one last thing Nadia mentioned when she asked Sheikh Al-Azhar, Dr. Ahmed Al-Tayyib in Cairo, why doesn't the senior leadership of Sunni Islam declare ISIS as non-Islamic? Because I know this is a common question that I get. Our understanding of organizations like ISIS, it's even worse than apostasy, because there is no capital punishment for apostasy. The Prophet said that these people are khawarij, they are outliers. And in all of his mercy and all of his love and all of his beautiful teachings, he said, Al-Khawariju Ahlun Nar, wa fi riwaya Al-Khawarij Kilabun Nar. He said that the Khawarij are the dogs of hellfire. And he said, Tuba liman qatalahum wa qatalu. Glad tidings to those that fight them and kill them and are killed in the process of killing them, about the Khawarij, about the outliers. So it's even worse, it's even more of a derogatory statement, a derogatory label than being an apostate. And it is an obligation on all of us in the family of Islam to do what we can to combat it with whatever tools that we have at our disposal.
Just one very quick question for either you or Mr. Hassan. of the, what is the Muslim population, 1.4 to 1.6 billion people, what percent of that population adheres to this barbaric ideology? Do you have any sense of that whatsoever?
For me?
Whoever has an estimate.
No, ISIS doesn't need a lot of numbers. Over the, we've seen this recently when they start being put, like when there's a force that pushes them in a certain area, they can hold a territory like with 200 people. I think they are a very a small minority. Even within the Syrian rebel groups, they are still a smaller group than others. But I think because of the sheer violence and brutality, they deter people. And they use the word tashrid usually in their literature, which means deterrence with extreme violence, brutality. So when they kill one person, they make sure that 100 or 1,000 people see that person being killed.
Senator Carper.
Thank you. Did you say we have 5 minutes?
Yeah, we were trying to. There's so many people here, so.
Okay.
Short and prerogative.
Again, our thanks to each one of you for joining us today and for sharing with us some parts of your life that are not easily shared. And we are deeply grateful to each of you, but especially to you, Nadia. Thank you. Here in the United States, we are, as you probably know, people of many different religions. We are Protestant, we're Catholic, we're Jew, we're Muslim, we're Hindu, we're Buddhist, and we're other religions as well. And one of the reasons why our country was established was because of the concept and nature of freedom of religion, people yearning to not just to be free, but be free to worship God as they saw fit. There are some people who take the Bible. Most people in America are probably Protestant and Catholic, most, but certainly not all. But some people who take verses of Scripture out of the Bible and they twist them into things in ways that they're not really meant to be done. And there are people in our own faith who bastardize our faith. They cherry-pick our faith. For a great example is an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. People take that as an admonition to go out and wreak vengeance on people that have wronged them. But that same verse of Scripture goes on to say, "Revenge is mine, saith the Lord." Revenge is mine, saith the Lord. There's another verse in the Scripture that says, when I was a stranger in your land, did you take me in? And we have some people in this country, some political leaders, I don't know that they've read Matthew 25, whatever their religion is, but there's some people in this country who have argued that the United States needs to stop accepting not just Syrian refugees, but in some cases, all Muslim refugees. And in the case of the Syrian refugees, they would not allow us to accept. That include people that are not Muslim. They could be different faiths. It could be Christian. They could be Jew, a variety of religions. And I would just ask, maybe starting with you, Mr. Al-Jawari, I would start with you, and just to ask, what are your opinions about a ban on, we'll say, all Syrian refugees, and how, or even all Muslim refugees, and how how such a ban would affect the ability in this country to counter ISIS propaganda and ideology? Would you go first?
I'm not really trained as a politician, so...
Neither are we. We're untrained.
At the risk of saying or making a political statement, I mean, I think as an American, I understand...
Now, my question is, what are your thoughts about how a ban on all Syrian refugees, or really all Muslim refugees, how does that affect our ability as a country to counter ISIS propaganda and ideology? That's my question.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's, as I understand our nation, I think it's un-American not to accept the refugees. And we have I think, a legal, political, and more importantly, moral authority to take people in that we can. And this is what this, e pluribus unum, this is what makes our nation great. And I think that from a social cohesion standpoint, societies that are more plural are stronger. I think that by bringing in refugees, we will be able to understand the problem more and see how we can help them more. But I think some sort of form of isolationism or some sort of rejection will only increase the problem and make it fester more.
Good, thanks. Other witnesses, please. Same question.
Sure. I can say two things. The first one is that I try to keep in touch with people who left Syria and they now live in Germany and other countries, and I've seen how positive the message that the European countries, and the case of here only recently here, that they accepted them, and that was a positive sense. Like you only hear good things from refugees. They praise the Germans and how hospitable they are, and how so on and so forth. And the second thing is that we have to recognize, I think, especially for the United States, that thousands of Syrian refugees who left Syria and they're in Turkey, in Europe or the United States, have been instrumental in the fight against ISIL. They provide intelligence, information, mapping, guidance, and ISIS operates in these areas that in eastern Syria, in northeastern Syria, and northwestern Iraq. And these people have been affected most by violence. They're driven out, and there is a reason why they were helpful in the fight against ISIS. That's.
All right, thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Nahas, just very briefly.
Okay. From my experience as a refugee myself, that I went through the process, I could say that it's very highly unlikely for the process to let any terrorist that comes. It's a highly intense process, which takes security checks, background checks, waiting period for over like a year, at least a year, and eyewitnesses, that they ask you a lot of personal questions, and for the slightest chance to let a terrorist or a guy or a girl that believes in these ideologies to pass through is highly unlikely.
All right, thank you. Nadia, could you briefly respond to my question? Very briefly, please.
بس جوابك küçük bir
الفيت شتي مدفياز بيجم جو حقي هر دولتك هيا جو حماية خوبك أس احتراموان قانونات كم قانونية هر دولتك يجي.
I would like first to say that every country has the right to protect itself and to protect its borders and its laws.
ولكن أو خلكي إجبر اضطهادك ديني أو خلكي جينوسايد بسريدة هاتي جنابي همو دريج البر بينا قردن.
But the people who are escaping from the religious discrimination and genocide, they should not face closed doors before them.
ومدفت تزاني بيجي قودا أف إرهاب ننكارن بين الريد وساو هجروان دا إرهاب هكا بفيبي كارب هر جهكي وكيرتين وهقالك شوان جريمة خواكر بنجي ودركات بنجي.
I would like just to say that if the terrorists want to go someplace, they can go regardless the process, and some of them have already immigrated.
I think we have a moral imperative here. We face in this country a moral imperative to be true to those words that are written at the Statue of Liberty. We have a moral imperative in where they happen to be, whatever faith you have. We have a moral imperative to Matthew 25. When you're a stranger in our land, did we take you in? But we also have a moral imperative to people who live here and want to live in safety and be able to live to be old and have kids and grandchildren. And so I think our challenge here is to make sure that while we need to be true to our faith in allowing people who are in distress and on the run and haunted by their memories, we need to be welcoming to them. We have to also at the same time have to be mindful of the need to protect our safety. And sometimes they're in conflict with one another. Last thing I want to say, Mr. Al-Jawari, and you doctor can comment on this later. But my understanding is every religion, just about every religion, including Islam, has a golden rule: treat other people the way we want to be treated. Is that true? And is that not true of Islam?
Yes, it is.
My view is if all of us would sort of abide by that, since that's part of all the fabric of all of our religions, we'd all be a whole lot better off on this planet. Thank you.
And Senator Carper, so we equally went over. Now I think we need to keep it to 5 minutes to be respectful of all the people here. So Senator Ayotte.
I want to thank the chairman. I want to thank all of you for being here. In particular, Mr. Nahas and Ms. Murad. We're so sorry for what you've gone through, and your courage in coming forward here today is very important for us to hear what you have endured, and it's horrific. But I wanted to follow up, Ms. Murad, on the issue that actually you raised, and I would like to have Dr. Al-Gawari comment on it. And that is, Doctor, you said that what Daesh is doing is beyond apostate. You've described it as the dogs of hellfire. And I would agree with that description. But what I want to understand is, to what Ms. Murad asked, as we look at how the reaction should be from, for example, I think she may have identified the Al-Zahar Seminary in Cairo, which I believe you studied at, which is a very, very important seminary in Islam. Do you believe that leaders in this seminary and other leaders in the Muslim world have described and have called out Daesh in the way that you have described it today, as forcefully as they should?
Thank you, Senator. So just a correction, those are my words. I was quoting Prophet Muhammad. Prophet Muhammad said that the outliers are the dogs of hellfire.
Right.
Which
But
I happen to agree with.
what I want to understand is to really answer her question. Do you think that leaders in a position to influence what Islam truly stands for, do you think that they have been forceful enough in calling out, whether you call them dogs of hellfire or apostate, however, how Daesh is warping, as you've testified today, your religion?
So I think there's yes and no. I think there are definitely those who are very outspoken. One scholar that comes to mind that we've worked with is Sheikh Muhammad Yaqoubi, himself a Syrian refugee for all intents and purposes, now living in Morocco. And he's written a very extensive fatwa, non-binding religious opinion in English against ISIS. And he actually makes the argument, which is a valid argument, that Daesh or ISIS are in fact outside of the folds of Islam. But if you've ever worked with scholars and academics, they're a little bit slow on the uptake and not very good in front of the camera. And I think that one of the
leaders to
well, that's one of the problems. I think one of the deficiencies, one of the weak points of Al-Azhar is its communications capacity. In a former life, I actually helped establish the Office of Communications for the Grand Mufti of Egypt between 2003, 2007, before I went to Princeton. And that was, wow, that was a coup. I mean, when I asked them, how do you deal with journalists? And they said, oh, we call the police and we arrest them. I said, no, you have to work with the media, because if you don't, what you're trying to say, what the Mufti is trying to say is not going to get out there. So I think there's a lot of training that can happen to help that. But I agree with you. There is more needs to be done and more voices need to be heard.
Thank you. Ms. Murad, I wanted to say, I believe that Daesh has engaged in war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. How important do you believe it is? You have put in your written testimony today, and you've also told us, how important is it for the United States to formally recognize Daesh's actions as genocide? And I mean with reference to the Yazidis and what you've told us today about how they're treating the Yazidis.
أفتشتكي قالك مهمش مرة جو اعتراف بيكرن جو بسري ازدياهاتي جينوسايدا.
It's very important for us that what happened to us to be acknowledged as a genocide.
الشانس دايما هي وقت المتحدة جو اعتراف كرجوت أباب سري ازدياهاتي جينوسايدا. بعد سالة إنساني إزدي حياة السرقة ببونو بس إرك أمل جرا شيبو بفي بيفي.
On the 16th of this month, just a few days ago, when the UN acknowledged the genocide, for the Yazidis who've been hopeless for the past 2 years, this was the first time they started having some hope.
شوية كمد في وكا احترافي بيكرن جواب سري ما هاتي جينوسايدش بر جريمة ما نتشتكي في شارتي بو جريمة ما هتانوها مستمر نو هتانوها افتش داري جاويت عالمي هموي وداعش في تشتي نبد زيمات كشوية كي مدفي وكا همو كاب بنيرن الجريمة وكاب بنيرن كحقي في كيتشا.
I would like these crimes to be legally recognized by you, and I would like to be acknowledged, and I would like you to look into the crimes, the things that I've said today, and the things that Daesh have done, not secretly. They've publicly have said they will do it, and they've did it, and I would like you to look at these crimes and evidences.
I want to thank all of you for being here, and I would just say there is a Senate resolution, Resolution 340, which would call this for what it is, a genocide. And I hope that we can come together and declare, I would like to see the administration declare this a genocide, and I also would like us as a Congress to come together and declare this for what it is. Thank you.
Senator Tester.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of you for your testimony. Dr. Elgwary, I came in towards the last half of your comments, but one of the things you said right at the very end was that, I just want you to confirm this, ISIL has nothing to do with religion. Did I hear you right?
ISIS has nothing to do with Islam, is what I believe I said.
Okay, so tell me the difference real quick.
I began by saying that normative Islam in its Sunni and Shia expressions is defined by an interpretive methodology.
Okay.
And I walked through a little bit about the high level of what that is.
Right.
And that the texts that we have, what we believe to be divine texts, live in time. And there's a discursive tradition in which how we interpret these verses and these injunctions for the moment that we live in. But ISIS, they're unlettered, they're completely unlettered in the religion and the fundamentals of the religion, nor do they have an interpretive methodology. So what they conclude is based on their own whims and desires from what they're reading prima facie without understanding the text itself.
Okay, gotcha. So I keep coming back to why these guys exist. There's absolutely a criminal element, because we saw that in Paris and we saw it in Brussels. The people belong to ISIL. There's also doctors, engineers, well-educated folks that are part of it, that, quite frankly, shouldn't be a part of a twisted ideology as this. Could you tell me what about their ideology appeals to that broad of a base of crooks and professionals and everything in between?
So maybe Hassan will know more because he's actually interviewed some of them. But I mean, intellectually or academically, I think that the first thing I would point out is that I don't know if they necessarily believe in what ISIS is saying, or they're coerced to believe in what ISIS is saying or what they're holding to be true. I also think that
coerced by force.
Yeah, coerced by them, by ISIL, and and whatnot.
So you believe this, or you're going to die?
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of coercion.
As we heard from Nadia, for example, and other stories that have come out from ISIL-controlled areas.
Okay.
I also think that there's a spectrum of extremism thought within Islam.
Okay.
And I think that it can start as something sort of innocuous, but there's something wrong with that way of thinking, and it can slide. And I think that when they find somebody that sort of looks like they're from central casting, they sort of just are able to pull them to that side.
There's a lot of folks in that group, it appears to me anyway. Would you want to comment very briefly on that, on what makes it, or just agree with the doctor if he's correct?
Yeah, I mentioned in the testimony before his that the people who believe in this sort of ideology that ISIS believes in, as in they really believe in it, are only there are two categories. People who are young zealots who are indoctrinated by another category, which is of long-standing radicals who believe in takfirism, which is declaring fellow Muslims as infidels, as apostates, based on specific criteria that they have. They rely on books like, there are two books that that come to mind. I don't want to get into too much detail there, but there is a book, for example, that's 1,000 pages of a man who, when he appears on TV and he explained his methodology of fatwa, he said fatwa should not be done in the same way that Muslim clerics have done it over the centuries. That I, as a person, I can declare you as a fellow Muslim as an apostate based on my impression of you, if you work with the West against Muslims, or if you're an agent to a certain government, and so on and so forth. So their criteria are very postmodernist in a way.
Okay, back to you, Dr. Tariq. So are there statements or actions the U.S. has taken that might encourage people to be a part of ISIL?
Say me?
No, I'm Dr. Tariq.
Oh, sorry.
To be honest, that's a tough question for me to answer. I think that the rhetoric that comes out of ISIL sometimes makes us think that if it were not for the U.S. invasion in Iraq, if it were not for the U.S. policy doing this or not the U.S. policy doing that. But the fact of the matter is that one can make that argument for any other country. One could make that argument for any other regional player in that region. And, you know, politics is all based about interest, geopolitical interest, and things like that. So I don't think that that's necessarily fair. I think because America is so dominant in the world and so out there, it's just an easy target, and it's just easy, oh, well, if America just stopped doing this, then we'll stop doing that. But that's not going to happen. We know that. If we stop doing whatever they say, they're not going to change.
All right. Well, my time is up. I want to thank you all for your testimony. I'll submit, I'll submit questions to the record if appropriate, Mr. Chairman.
It will
Thank
be.
you.
Senator Heidkamp.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for such thoughtful comments and for such thoughtful words and such courage and bravery, especially our last two witnesses. I think everyone here who frequently spends a lot of time on their smartphones during testimony sat and really listened, and really you moved us all. Thank you so much for your courage and for the fact that you're survivors, and as survivors you're willing to provide testimony as to the horror and as to the imperative that we all as good people need to engage. But I want to, for a minute, turn to our first two witnesses and just kind of engage in a discussion about message and messengers. Doctor, I was fascinated by the work that you've done, basically parsing kind of the perversion and responding to the conversion of Islam, or the perversion of Islam that is being done by these radical groups. And obviously, having met with people who have been radicalized, have a pretty good sense of, you know, what messages could we deliver that would actually make a difference, especially in this country, when now I think our greatest threat is radicalization of young men and women or American citizens. We've seen that now twice. And so there's two parts of a message. It's the right message and then the messenger. And I'm just going to make a couple points. I want both of you to respond to what you think the right message is and the right messenger. And I want to know if you're familiar with what the Department of Homeland Security is doing today to try and provide a counter message and offer any advice to us as we review that in our role of oversight. And that'll be the last question I ask, and I'd like that you both split up your time.
Thank you. In terms of messaging, I think it's different because it's complicated because ISIS should be treated as two organizations in one. There's the local one that it operates and operates on the ground in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere, like in Libya and elsewhere, and they have their own messaging, usually based on sectarianism. And there's the international one, which is very close to Al-Qaeda. They, in fact, are trying to recollect and regather the dispersed networks of Al-Qaeda that were basically dispersed after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and the campaign against it. So they're trying very hard to do that in Europe, in the United States and elsewhere, but also in North Africa. So the messaging should be different because they're different organizations. On the ground and internationally, there's this danger that what happens, its appeal on the ground has become an international appeal. Why? Because it presented itself as some sort of an idea that everyone is fighting, and the enemies of this organization are the West or Iran or something else. You know, that this organization stands for something. So the most effective messaging against this is to not talk too much about only the victims of ISIS outside the group that it claims to represent, but rather what's really happening on the ground, which is on a daily basis the group kills fellow Sunnis, people that it claims to represent, and we don't see that in media. For example, next to my village, I mentioned they killed 700 people. Only Washington Post, Liz Sly did a story about that. And that is, at the time, was the single most horrific massacre. They killed a lot of people, but they killed 700 people in a matter of days. That needs to be the message that, look, this is not an organization, not a sectarian organization, not an organization that represents a sect, or it's not an Islam versus the West. It is a crazy organization, extremist organization that recasts itself in religious terms that the people of that faith rejected. And that needs to be hammered again and again.
As far as messaging, I think there needs to be an unequivocal counter-narrative from Muslim religious leaders. No wishy-washy stuff, no, well, maybe there's 5 opinions on that. There's yes, no, black, white. There's right Islam, there's wrong Islam, period. What I've been trying to do in our organization in Word is I conduct a monthly traditional class we call al-halaqa, and I try to take one of the concepts that organizations like ISIL uphold, and I try to deconstruct it in a very detailed way. And my goal, obviously the audience is primarily Muslim, but my goal is for young Muslim people to understand why it's wrong, why there's a perversion in their thinking. Not that I'm saying I'm the example, but I think that kind of effort is what we need more of. And I think that the English language is actually very important in this regard, because a lot of the media that we've been seeing coming out of ISIL is in English and it appeals. So I think that's very important. As far as recommendations, some of the things that come to mind, for example, in our home county of Montgomery County in Maryland, we've noticed a drastic increase in bullying towards Muslim students in the Montgomery County public school systems. And I think that anti-bullying work is very important so that our children feel safe in schools, so that they're not pushed to the side, so they're not isolated. Also, in our organization, we work with helping refugees resettle, and I think those type of services are very important so that people like Subhi, Nadia, others that are coming as refugees, they have something to plug into, so they're not left to drift in the wind. So those are some of the things. And sorry, one last thing. I think that media training for Muslim leaders abroad is also very important. And I think there's a lot of good people. There's a lot of, I can't remember who we were talking about earlier, there's a lot of good leaders that are making the right argument, but they need to know how. You can't write a 40-page legal opinion and expect that to be trending on Twitter. It's just not going to happen. And when I told my teachers that, they're like, well, what we're saying is the dumbed-down version of what our teachers said. I said, okay, we have to stop the humility thing, and we have to be smart about how we inject this message into the media, because there's a certain way that media works. So media training, I think, is very, very important, social media, that kind of thing, for leaders abroad.
Thanks, Senator Heidenkamp. Again, I want to make sure everybody gets questions, so I'll ask everybody to be mindful of the 5-minute limit. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for our witnesses here today. And Ms. Murad and Mr. Nahas, thank you for your very compelling testimony and your journey here to this country. It's very important as we discuss refugees and folks like yourself who've been fleeing intense persecution and terror, that people see the human face of refugees who are in this country. Your presence here today is important. And hopefully many people will see that and be as moved as I know everybody on this panel has been moved by your testimony. So thank you for your courage to be here today. Dr. El-Gawari, I would like you to respond to what seems to be somewhat of a debate back and forth we're hearing in the political realm now as to whether or not we should call ISIS radical Islam. When you hear someone calling it radical Islam, do you think that's an accurate description of what we're seeing with ISIS?
They seem to be intent on getting all the difficult questions. One of the things they taught us at seminary is that there is no I'm just trying to translate in my head on the fly. There's nothing wrong with labels, because a lot of times we get stuck on labels. Or why are you saying this? Why are you calling that? And I think that labels are only what their definition is. When somebody says, I use that term radical Islam, and I know a lot of people in my community get upset, but what I mean by it is people that look Muslim, say they're Muslim, quoting the Quran and doing horrible things. I mean, what are we going to call them? They are terrorists for sure. But they're very different than, you know, a neo-Nazi group, for example. So I personally don't have a problem with that. When people say that, whether you know, Congress or the White House or in the media, I understand what is meant. However, I fear that that can very easily slide into, well, any form of religiosity from a Muslim is a form of radical Islam. And that's, I think, where the fear is that we limit it to what it's supposed to define.
Mr. Azad.
It's a good question because personally, when I was in the UAE last year, I was an advocate of using these terms and pressing on clerics to speak up against this organization. I remember the late Saudi king who died 2 years ago. He admonished clerics, the high clerics, for the first time in public, and he said, "I feel you're lazy. You're not speaking up against ISIS when it came out." But I think when I moved to the UK last year, I felt that there's a question of messenger. Who says this term and why? And it's important to keep this in mind. ISIS wants to divide. This is the thing that the ISIS did in the Middle East, and it's trying to do elsewhere. It wants to polarize its enemies, and it wants to polarize the society under its control, and they want to divide their enemies. And they've succeeded in the Middle East, and they're probably succeeding here by getting people busy talking about what to call it and what not to call it. I think what's clear is that this organization is, like Doctor said, declared war on Islam. This is how it should be seen. It's a problem within the Islamic world, and it needs to be dealt there. And here, what can be done is to help Muslims fight this organization.
I appreciate that. The issue that we face here in the United States in dealing with this threat deals with lone wolves, folks who may be inspired by what they see in the ideology. Is it safe to say the folks who may be inspired by this are folks who really have very little understanding of Islam? Is there a correlation there? And does that have something to do with this recent shooter who was claiming allegiance, I believe, to ISIS, but also at some point Hezbollah, and how that may be inconsistent? And if you could kind of address what may be going on in the minds of lone wolves, things that we should be considering as to how we respond to this phenomenon?
So I would say absolutely. People that self-radicalize, just like the radicals that we've been speaking about this morning, they have very little to no understanding of the religion whatsoever. And that's really the danger. And part of that is that they have no training, they have no living teacher that they can sit with, they can ask questions, and this discursive, interpretive tradition that I described earlier takes place. So I think that that's definitely a fear, people that are surfing online, finding a lecture here, finding a statement there, cutting and pasting these together and formulating some kind of conclusion and acting on it. I definitely think it's a problem. And I think that more instruction, more religious literacy for Muslims will help in that regard.
Right.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to add my words of appreciation and thanks to our panel. Very, very powerful testimony. Thank you for being here. Wanted to start, I know the hearing is about the ideology of ISIS, of Daesh, and yet it was called in the wake of a horrible tragedy in Orlando that was at once a terrorist-inspired attack and also a hate crime, in this case against members of the LGBT community. It was also Latin night at the club, and it's unclear whether that was contributing to the targeting of the club on that particular night. Mr. Nahas, when you were testifying, you shared with us that attacks against LGBT Syrians preceded the formation of ISIL, that it was called for or tolerated or perpetrated by the regime as well as militants who opposed the regime in Syria, that they too perpetrated violence against LGBT Syrians. In the U.S., violence, bullying, intimidation, discrimination against members of the LGBT community has a long history also. And in the early days, you could certainly argue that it was sanctioned at one point in our nation's history by the government also. But things have changed. And I want to just draw attention to something you highlighted in your testimony about the UN Security Council acting very recently to recognize that LGBT rights are human rights. A first in that international forum. You highlighted it as something that is very important in moving forward. I guess I want to ask, in terms of your proposals, your recommendations to this committee and to others, how important it is for governments, for authorities, for regimes to say LGBT rights are human rights, and how dangerous is the absence of that, the silence to that?
Thank you, Senator, for this important question. From my own experience growing up as a gay man in Syria, I know that I knew at an early age that the government has laws against us, and we're not. My existence was not legal, so I was not allowed to say it out loud. I was not allowed to be out in the open. It was punishable up to 3 years in prison. This is the least, and worse, that it could be persecuted by your own community members. So it's very important for us to put the words out there, to say to governments and hold them accountable, to tell them that this is LGBT rights are human rights. They are not, from my understanding, my community and traditions say that LGBT rights are only sexual rights. They don't relate at all to human rights. And to make this message clear to governments and communities in their governments, it's very important to at least start to elevate the consequences that I witnessed in my country, where we're being bullied all the time, persecuted, harassed in the streets, even verbally and physically abused. And we could not go anywhere. We could not go to the police. We could not tell our families, because if we do, they will persecute us more, because they will always say, you have to man up and defend yourself. This is not an issue that you can talk about. But if these international platforms were used in a proper way to deliver the message, to tell the governments that these rights should be addressed properly, it delivers a very strong message.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up at, I'm out of time.
If you do it for the record.
So a question for the record then. Senator Peters was asking questions about self-radicalization and lone wolves. And I think in the case of Orlando, it is not clear how deep of an understanding the perpetrator, the gunman, had with ISIL. He appeared to have relationships online with various terrorist organizations. But I guess I want to ask an even broader question about self-radicalization, because we have seen in recent instances of mass gun violence in the U.S., people who were self-radicalized but inspired by different types of hatred, hatred of minority religion, as we saw in Wisconsin, Mr. Chairman, when a gunman entered the Sikh temple in Oak Creek, as we saw in Charleston, motivated by racial hatred. What can we learn about self-radicalization in studying those who have been self-radicalized by ISIL when dealing with self-radicalization for people who hold different types of hatred?
And the witnesses can answer that in written responses. Senator Langford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate your bravery in coming forward and your courage to be able to speak out. These are important days, and we need to be able to hear clear, articulate voices. And I thank you for bringing that. Mr. Hassan, let me ask you, what is the end goal for ISIS? What do they see on the horizon? They are fighting for what, and they will know they have achieved it when?
Well, they say they want a caliphate that dominates the world. This is their stated mission. I think their realistic objective is to control Syria, Iraq, and expand in the region and become this leader of jihad and global jihad. That's why they spend so much effort on targeting Al-Qaeda. They are more critical of Al-Qaeda than probably other ones because they see them as their competitors and their rivals. So their goal is regional dominance, but obviously they want to expand in the West and elsewhere.
So you talk about the regional dominance, yet they're trying to motivate people in Western countries, whether it be in Europe, United States, Australia, wherever it may be, to be able to fight and attack in those locations as well. So why try to motivate people in Australia or in the United States or in Europe to be able to fight for them if the goal is the caliphate there?
Yeah, well, I mean, listen to them and how they talk, reading their books, the books that they say they read, pamphlets and so on. They talk about the war today, and this is important, I think, for the anti-ISIS campaign today, because there is this tendency to think about tactical defeats as strategic defeat against ISIS, and that's not true. ISIS presents itself as it's a long-term project. They talk about Nikaya as a tactic, which is a war of attrition. So they want to exhaust the West, exhaust everyone else. So they think 10 years ago we were fighting the Americans. The Americans were in Iraq and they had the appetite to fight us. 10 years later, President Obama had little appetite or less appetite to fight us. In 10 years' time, that would be even less. They have a core, and that's the most important part of ISIS, a core that is mostly consistent of security officials. These are the most dangerous people. Many of them were former members of Saddam Hussein's mukhabarat or security apparatus. They shape the organization in terms of how it operates and how it works and how it ensures its survival. So I think they have that goal. That core won't go away. You could defeat the organization, defeat the members who joined it 2 years ago and so on. But they think of their long-term strategy as a strategy of Nikaya or a war of attrition.
Okay, so if you go back 15 years ago or 10 years ago, the United States was talking and challenging, and the West was challenging leadership in Islam to call out al-Qaeda, which was happening, and to say that is not consistent. Now it is a challenge towards ISIS or Nusra Front or whoever it may be, and to say that does not line up with theology. How does we see this springing up in multiple areas around the world? This, what you use the term, I think it's very familiar term, this radical Islam is twisting off. But it's not just around ISIS. It's around mostly ISIS today, but could be Nusra Front, could be al-Qaeda, could be others. It's a more broad system. So is it a confront ISIS, or is it a confront a larger set of teachings that's separate from traditional Islam?
Well, that's the difference between defeating the organization tactically. You can launch military, a very effective military campaign against it, and you can defeat it. You can expel it from Mosul, Raqqa, Fallujah. But the organization's appeal and the spectrum, the broader appeal of groups like it, like-minded groups like Al-Qaeda, other Islamist groups that believe in violence and long-term, like as a strategic goal rather than violence for, just because they're pushed to violence.
Does the worldwide movement of ISIS diminish if they do not have a functioning caliphate in Syria and in Iraq?
It will, but the fear, I think we've reached a point today where what's happening on the ground in Iraq and Syria doesn't affect so much the international appeal of ISIS. And this is, I think, directly because the campaign against ISIS has not been done properly. using the wrong forces to fight ISIS in towns that these organizations are viewed suspiciously is a disastrous campaign that even State Department officials complained about it and said in that letter, the dissent document, saying, for example, allowing the YPG, which is an organization affiliated to the PKK in Turkey, which is designated by the U.S. as a terrorist organization, using that organization to fight ISIS, another terrorist organization, in Sunni Arab areas, that's just wrong. So I think the campaign today is allowing ISIS to convert territorial losses into legitimacy in that region specifically. And that's why I've been warning time and again that the campaign is not being done properly. It's only making ISIS stronger.
Thank you.
Senator Booker.
Yeah, I think Senator Langford's line of questioning is really right on, and I'd like to pick up right where he left off. And so, first of all, you say in your testimony, you can defeat the group in Raqqa, Mosul, Fallujah, but these defeats will remain tactical unless this group is discredited by the same people it claims to represent. Could you go a little deeper into that? So what specifically then are you advising for us to do as we get these? We're shrinking their territory clearly, but it seems like you're saying that we're giving them more strength in some ways in the way that we're doing it. Can you be a little more specific about what you're suggesting?
That's a question. And I think we defeated ISIS, if I want to speak as the other side. ISIS was defeated in Iraq in 2006 after the surge. But ISIS came back and took Mosul. It was defeated from 2006 to 2010. It was a very marginal organization in Iraq. Sunni Arabs that in the areas that ISIS operated in defeated the organization, worked with the Americans, and policed their areas. That worked. But then the policy that followed in 2010, when the United States pulled out of Iraq before Iraq was able to govern itself, and because there was perceived support between cooperation between the U.S. and Iran to work with Maliki, who is a sectarian prime minister, and work with him despite the fact that he was weakened, and there's a rival, another Shia rival who's more moderate and more tolerant, was supported. And then, the mistakes that followed, that very success between 2006 and 2010 led to circumstances that enabled ISIS in 2012 to tell all Sunnis in these areas, look, the only way forward is for us to work together and reject this government from our area. And they were able to rally people, mobilize people against this government, and that's why they were able to take Mosul in 2014, in the summer of 2014, took Mosul, forced the Iraqi army to drop its arms and flee, and they took massive weaponry, the American weaponry, and they went back, marched back into Syria, and they took Deir ez-Zor and fortified Raqqa, and they took some of Hasaka and so on. They became a strong organization because the political failures that there. And my fear is that there's so much focus on the military component rather than on the political and social and religious dimensions to what's going on there.
And so I see your point, and I also appreciate in your testimony discussing how we in the West should be trying to discredit or have Islamic voices discrediting Daesh. And maybe that gets me to your testimony, which I thought was really wonderful, discussing all the ways that they're perverting Islam in the way that they're waging their war, and taking advantage of our political and failures in terms of how we're gaining territory. And so this is not a clash of civilizations. This is people perverting Islam and taking advantage of political realities. And so I just want to get from you, and you said this already, but I want to go one step deeper. For us, who focus so much on CVE efforts here in the Senate, what are the specific tactics then to start to expose ISIL for for the perversions that they're doing and discredit them? What are some of the best ways to go about that?
Thank you, Senator. I really believe in the counter-narrative. And that's very, very important, because when I started to do this, less than a year ago, I realized that there's no very articulate, very clear-cut counter-narrative. And by counter-narrative, I mean, how does Islam deal with issues of plurality? How do we deal with issues of democracy, citizenship, constitutional nation states? All of these things have been argued in the last 200-300 years by Muslim jurists, but unknown to the vast majority of Muslims. So a lot of the issues that Daesh, ISIL, whatever, claim are the bones that they're picking with modernity really have been dealt with already. It's just the memo hasn't been passed around. So the counter-narrative is effective because it's steeped in very rigorous, authentic scholarship. It's based on the primary sources, the Quran, the Sunnah, which are very important for Orthodox
And Doctor, I'm
Muslims.
going to interrupt you there because being mindful of my time, and that's helpful, and I hope you'll make yourself available if we have further questions. I just want to say in my remaining 10 seconds to Mr. Nahas and Ms. Murad, your testimony was so courageous and so moving. The outrageous attacks going on against LGBT people in the Middle East and here in the United States, which, as you point out in your testimony, is the most common types of hate crimes we see. I'm grateful for your honesty and your courage, Ms. Murad, is really just so profound, and I'm grateful that you would come here today and share your story, which is so important to be heard. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Senator Booker. I actually want to kind of pick up on both the, Senator Langford and Senator Booker's line of questioning, just in terms of, what's been the reality situation in terms of where is ISIS right now, in terms of, success or lack of success against it. There's a State Department report. It's called the START report, Study of Terrorism, Response to Terrorism. Very difficult numbers there. They're very inaccurate. They're changing all the time. But when I looked at, and I did a little calculation, the number of, globally, the number of people killed in terrorist attacks prior to 9/11 is a little under 5,000. With updated numbers, that's grown, 5, 6, 7 times. So this is a real, and from my standpoint, a growing threat. ISIS, the news reports show that outside of Syria, ISIS inspired attacks that have cost 1,191 lives. Was that just last 2 years? Last year? The analogy I've been using in terms of, and I realize we've made some progress, okay, we've taken back some territory, but they still control territory. And the analysis I'm somewhat using is that of a beehive. You might have a beehive in your backyard. You can poke it with a stick and do damage to the hive, but you're also stirring up the hive. Is that what we're witnessing? And what is the danger there? And isn't it true that we do have to defeat ISIS? We do have to deny them that territory. We have to deny them that caliphate. But then we've got a lot of mopping up to do. And these Islamic terror groups, if anything, they're spreading, they're growing, they're evolving, they're metastasizing. It is like a cancer. And we're not winning this battle. Mr. Hassan.
Well, I come from the position that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are growing, and there will be other groups that join them, so they're on a trajectory of expanding for the next decade or even two. And it's important, I think, at this moment, ISIS is being rolled back. It's being defeated territorially in Iraq and Syria. Like the statistic mentioned before, 50% in Iraq. They lost 50% of their territory. In Syria, they lost 20% of their territory. And in Libya, they're also on the back foot. And in Libya, they're struggling to even establish any presence there. Al-Qaeda is doing very well in Yemen. The same thing in Afghanistan. They're not doing very well there. So their capacity currently is limited. However, I think the ability to inflict damage is strong. They benefit from the open space, obviously, on the internet, the self-radicalization. You can become self-radicalized by watching a video by Anwar al-Awlaki, the American citizen who was killed in a drone attack in 2011, I think. It's very easy to become one of them. The radicalization, the sort of radicalization that leads someone to ISIS is swift and animating, meaning they can push a person in a very short time to do some damage. It's very hard to predict it, but it's there. It's a danger that will remain for.
But a short answer. I mean, the gains were rolling up in Syria and Iraq. Does that give you much comfort? Because you're saying this is a long-term project. You think they're growing in strength over the next decade or two.
Yeah, and briefly, that's good. The problem is the other tracks, the political track, the social, religious, and the political process in Iraq and Syria, the conflict, is lagging behind. If they are catching up to the military advances, then ISIS will go away for a while. But for now, the problem is the focus on military, while you neglect the other things is the problem.
Dr. El-Gawari, I want to shift a little bit to the Muslim Brotherhood. I think it's oftentimes reported as maybe a more moderate group. Do you have any thoughts about Muslim Brotherhood?
I have a lot of thoughts about the Muslim Brotherhood and like groups. I think that goes back to what I was trying to say earlier, the concept of the spectrum. And I think these Islamist groups, while some of them are on the very left of the spectrum, while some of them are not necessarily open to violence, there are certain procedural changes. If those took places, if certain boxes were ticked on the form, violence then would be authorized. I mean, look at what's happened in Egypt, my home country, country of my family. So I think that I'm always shocked, utterly shocked at how engaging our government is of organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood, quite frankly. And when I speak to people in the embassy in Cairo, when I was living there for a while, and I say, why don't you engage with Muslim leaders? And they're like, we do. We engage with so-and-so, so-and-so, and so-and-so, and they give me a drop-down list of all these Islamist Muslim Brotherhood activists. So I think there's a big mismatch, and I think by engaging with them so openly and so freely, we almost legitimize that that approach. So I think that it's dangerous. I think it's definitely on the spectrum, but it does not necessarily, it's not a necessity that it will go from one end of the spectrum to another, but it's definitely on the spectrum that I'm concerned about.
Senator Carper.
Thanks. Again, we thank each of you for being with us today and spending this time with us and sharing your thoughts with us and your advice as well. I want to start with a question. I think I'll start, Ms. Hassan, I'll start with you, but then invite other witnesses to respond too. But I think in your testimony, you wrote that the United States must highlight that the war with ISIS is not a sectarian conflict. That's pretty much what you said, I think. And you point out that there are Muslims of both Shia and Sunni Islam joining Christians, joining Jews, and joining people of all religions and ethnic backgrounds in fighting ISIS. With that said, some people here in the U.S. are trying to paint this as a battle against ISIS as a broad clash between the West and with Islam. I think our president's made it clear that he believes this kind of rhetoric is dangerous and it is patently false and it plays directly into the hands of ISIS. And I would just ask, do you agree with this?
I agree that this is not a sectarian war, and this is not a war. I mean, it's not an Islam versus West war. In fact, if anything, the war ISIS is all about Muslims versus Muslims. This is what the ideology is built on. If you track, I mean, we can talk about ideas and ideology, but if you, practically speaking, like the way that ideology of ISIS has matured and become kind of framed was a reaction to what the events that happened after the Iraq War. Not the Iraq War itself, but how, for example, Sunnis reacted to the presence of Americans on the ground, and they started declaring these people as apostates, and what's the punishment for these people. So they started to appropriate events in Islamic history to the context that's going on here. So it wasn't at all about the West. It's about what's going on the ground in the Muslim world.
Thank you. Dr. El-Gawari, again, the question is, do you agree that sort of portraying this war as against ISIS as a war against Islam plays directly into the hands of ISIS or not?
I mean, I sort of agree with what Hassan was saying. I think, if anything, the victim of ISIL is Islam itself. And they have definitely declared war on our scholars, our normative tradition, our Sunni and our Shia sects. And that's the biggest tragedy. And I don't think that, and I think that our best allies in this are normative Muslims that are people like me. I mean, my life is in threat just by being here, speaking out against this. And I don't say that lightly. And I think that I want to stop that, but more probably than you do. I mean, I really want this to end, and I want to know what I can do to push that forward. And I think in that desire is the greatest ally we have to counter the rhetoric and the ideas that are coming out of ISIL.
All right, thank you. Mr. Nahas, same question, please.
Yeah, I'm sorry I don't have the capacity to answer this question.
All right. Nadia, do you want to respond to that question, please? Do you agree that painting this war against ISIS as a war against ISIS that plays Islam, is a war against Islam that plays directly into the hands of ISIS? And inadvertently we're helping ISIS by portraying this as a war against Islam.
أفتشنا نمساعدة داعش تيكرن أفتشنا هم كير مشو جهاندا بري هرتش تجي بشتي أمريكا مجهاندا مصر ومجهاندا الكويت كوأس جمن عوان شبابا بك مجبر أس إنسانك بوان داعش هالرعيش مما إشوان فيهم كير.
The first thing I did, I went to Egypt and to Kuwait to deliver that message because the things that happened to me, I wanted to go to these countries and to tell them what happened to me.
شوي كيس بيجم وان جريمة شوي كي بيجم هدفي داعش تشا فكريوي تشا جريمة هكامات كيرن تشا جوجا أسوان شبابا الشعر بكم نحاولين نشن.
I want to prevent the youth from joining the Islamic State. I went and I told them what crimes were committed, what actions, what ideology they had. I want to stop the flow of the youth to them.
إجبروي كيفنا نمساعدة بيج داعش را.
Speaking against this is not help for Daesh. You have to speak against it.
وكيم كرنا داعش الكيم ندا داعش حدودي بتني 3000 ميلة داعش بدهيت هزارة هطانو هاجي.
Also minimizing the role of Daesh or the power is not right because only ISIS border is more than 3,000 miles and they protect it all. There are tens of thousands are fighting for them.
هنا قندشيد ما مجرد سدو بينجي مالين هيج فد سالين نكارن وان قندا بحررين هنجي داعشي تيده بجش مدينة مازن راكاتشان داعشي تيده.
Some of our villages are only 150 people are living in small villages. We have not been able to recapture these villages for a year and a half. So how about the big cities? It's not a small power.
شوي كيس بينم هجش ما يرابو تشتاقو بضد في داعشي أفنقو أم ضد إسلامتية ياقو أم وان باردنياك شيعة وسنة تشتكي وصنع هدفي ما هموك كإنسان بغض النظر عن الدين وهر تشتكي هدفي ما هموك ياقو أف إرهاب بسكيني وهمو بسلام بيك رب عايشن.
Speaking against ISIS does not mean speaking against Islam and also does not mean speaking in favor of Sunnis or Shias one against another. When we all speak together against this, then we are united, then we can defeat it.
My time has expired. Mr. Chairman, you and I are both supporting legislation that would strengthen the ability of the Department of Homeland Security to reach out to faith communities, to reach out to civic groups, parents, community leaders in order to prevent ISIS from recruiting Americans, which we believe is the greatest threat that we face. And if I could just have 30 seconds and ask Dr. El-Jawari, what advice would you have for the Department of Homeland Security as they put together and implement this outreach to a broad community to focus on reducing the likelihood that people will be radicalized here? Just maybe one strong piece of advice to the Department of Homeland Security.
Work with us.
Okay, thank you.
And Senator Carper, I will give all the witnesses a chance to just have a closing comment after we go to Senator Booker, but I do want to quick ask Nadia a question. Who helped you escape?
Microphone.
A Muslim family.
I think that answers the question. Senator Booker.
Senator Carper, Doctor, his pointed question, which you said, help us basically help you. But we're looking at specific efforts that are being going on to activate lone wolves in the United States, cells in Belgium and France. And this is the part of the war that obviously hits Western countries right where they are, being preached at, where citizens of those countries and American citizens are finding the ISIS ideology and the perversion of Islam so compelling that they're willing to take up arms against their fellow citizens in Europe or in the United States of America. And clearly, we're doing a lot already, trying to empower local organizations in our communities, working with mosques. And we've had panels here where folks have given testimony about that. We now have allocated more resources toward that. I've been one of the people that's saying CVE efforts should not be law enforcement focused. They should be focused on empowering communities, empowering those networks. If CVE becomes just more police, more surveillance, and more of that, it's not going to really help us really deal with the core of the problem. And what I found so compelling about you is you pointed out so clearly, in a way that I learned a lot from your testimony, so clearly that this is a perversion of Islam. This is not Islam we're fighting against. This is people that are using it to fuel hatred, violence, and, as Hassan said, tactically for political objectives, to control territory, and to expand the reach of their totalitarian ends. But my concern is I still think we need to be doing more, frankly a lot more, to counter that narrative. And I liked what you said in one of your responses, that another paper, another 150-page paper is not that effective against the memes that you often see online that often seduce and pull in sort of vulnerable souls to this kind of terroristic activity. So I understand your sort of short answer to a short question, but I'm trying to figure out what are the specific strategies, and we're seeing some of them that are working, where you expose the fact that ISIL is killing far more Muslims, killing far more Sunnis than they are killing people in the West, that really begin to expose this so that those young people who might be susceptible to them see them for who they are, naked before their eyes. And those are the kind of strategies that we need to start really investing in more. And so in the 2 minutes I left you in a 3-minute preamble, could you go really to the core of those things that if you were making the investments in the budgets that we have to oversee, where would you be placing those dollars more specifically?
We have a very successful model in Montgomery County called the BRAVE model. It's a public-private partnership. We work with law enforcement. We work with the county executive. It's a really good program. It's getting national recognition. We're trying to export this model, train other people in other counties in the country that need this type of message. What I do in this model is I do a lot of the counter-narrative. I would love to be able in a position where I can train other young Muslim leaders in this country and our counterparts in Western Europe on what these points of I did the research. I'm happy for them to take it. I'm happy for them to say they did it. I don't, maybe my colleagues will be upset about that, but I'm happy for people just to get the message out there. I also mentor people that might be on the spectrum that are referred to us by law enforcement, the school board, that might be on the spectrum, but there's no capacity for local government to deal with them. I sit down with them, I talk with them, I try to decipher, is there a problem? Are they on the spectrum? Is it a mental health issue? Then we try to refer them out to county-wide programs that will help them. So this public-private partnership is working. It's working in our county, and I think if I had, some say on the purse strings, I would like to see us to be in a position to train other counties first in the country where it's needed the most, and I would like us to go overseas, Western European cities like Brussels, London, and work with our counterparts over there to train them in this model.
And that's a proactive strategies that often save a lot of money on the reaction that we would have to do with law enforcement or, God forbid, something happening. Today, your all testimonies have been testimonies of courage. What you said, people should understand that you are risking your life by coming here, by speaking truth, by laying bare the evil that we are up against. And for that, I am deeply grateful.
Thanks, Senator Booker. And you are right. I mean, just think of the evil that people are threatening somebody speaking the truth with their lives. Again, I'd like to offer all the witnesses about a minute to just make a final comment, and we'll start with you, Mr. Hassan.
We sort of covered most of the ground, but I want to just emphasize that we all need to show ISIS show what it is on the ground, like what it does to the people that it claims to represent. We need to emphasize that these are its victims as much as the others are, and I think that needs to be present in media. It's not one person's war; it's everyone's war.
Hey, Mr. Hassan. By the way, Doctor, you got the harder questions because you got Doctor in front of your name. But Doctor.
It's actually at the end of the name on the... Senator Johnson, Senator Carper, thank you for the opportunity to address the committee, to submit testimony about something that is much more than work. This is something very personal. I think of my children when I come here and how the rhetoric, even though they're young, the political rhetoric, unfortunately, is something that scares them. And I hope that what we're doing here will help build a more resilient homeland so that the America that they grow up in will be better than the America that I grew up in. Thank you.
Mr. Nahas.
Thank you, Senators, for the opportunity, for allowing me to speak in front of you. And every time that I have the chance to speak and talk about my experience, I always think about my counterparts that are still in danger, that are still under a threat, especially because they are different, because they are not they don't conform with other people's expectations. And I hope that the United States will take a stand and will be more active, like in holding government and other actors on the ground accountable for their actions and do something about this. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Ms. Murad, Nadia.
قالك ممنون شو وقالك ممنون اجتماعاتي هم يقود قوي خدانا ما.
Thank you, and thank you also for all the attendees and witnesses who came here.
وأتمنى قوم همو بيقرا كاربن ومهمو بيقرا رابن بإرهابي بالسكينين.
I wish that we all can work together and stand up together to stop this terrorism.
وهروس استلبش وجدكم قهن اعترافي بجينوسايد ما بكنو أو داعش العراقي وسوريا يشكتشك هطايب ما زنقو بيا محاسبة كرن أو دستوي الفي جريمة دهي وبيا عدالتي.
I would like also for you to recognize our genocide and to bring every single one from the Islamic State, whether a leader, middle, or a soldier, to bring everyone who committed these crimes to justice.
We would love to see that. Again, thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, before we adjourn, I don't have any more questions, but I just would like to certainly to thank all of you. And one of the key takeaways for me here is, you know, we talk a lot here about the golden rule, treating other people the way we want to be treated. We both have children. Our children are out of school, out into the world. But the schools that they went to, there was bullying. There was bullying. And in some cases, I remember as a parent who was aware of some bullying that was going on, actually going to the school and speaking out against and trying to make sure that did not persist. And I think we're successful. But I applaud folks of the Islamic faith. I really applaud those who are speaking up, in some cases at real risk to your own personal safety. We want to make sure you don't pay any price for that, but that's a matter of real concern. But for the kids who are being bullied because they happen to have a name like Al-Ghawari or Hassan or Nahas or Murad, I especially I'm concerned about them, that they somehow are paying a price as well. And I think part of, if I were giving them advice, it would be to be vocal and brave in speaking out against the kinds of abuses that we see perpetrated by ISIS. And I think maybe the best protection that they have is to denounce those kind of activities. And it may be a hard thing to ask kids to do, but I think at the end they will be safer, and I think ultimately will feel better about their own situation. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Carper. Again, I want to thank all the witnesses for your testimony, for your courage. You certainly have, I think, accomplished our goal of laying out a reality, helping us understand this better. We have a long way to go and fully understand this. The American people do, but you certainly helped that. So again, thank you for your testimony and your courage. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until July 6th at 5 p.m. for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is adjourned.